Oh, it was so crazy. When it came in, it landed and the tail went back, and then it started to spin, and then it ended up where the nose was on towards the ground. The tail ended in the air. The tail end came back down, and then it continued to spin on the runway.
Could you hear anything? Did you hear any of the engines potentially adding power?
No, I was inside. I couldn't really hear anything.
And then when you saw what you saw and the plane came to a rest in that smoke, what did you do?
I stood there. I felt so helpless. I didn't know whether to call 911 or to just stand there and watch. So I just
and then watched. Did you see people coming out of the plane? And what was the next step?
Well, about 2
so
3 minutes after the plane hit, the flight ejected out, and I could see through my camera lens that people were signal.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry.
About 2 or 3 minutes after the plane crashed, the slides ejected out of the side of the plane, and I could see people getting off.
Well, Isabella, we thank you for joining us this morning. Quite a terrible experience that you went through, and our hearts and sympathy, obviously, are for all those who are on board that plane. And we thank you for coming on and describing these events that we'll never forget. Isabella, thank you. Well, investigators now are beginning to even rule out some of the causes for this crash, including potential engine failure. In a statement that was made today, Asiana Airlines CEO Yoon Young-do says the Boeing plane was purchased in 2006, and he says, quote, "We acknowledge that there were no problems caused by the 777-200 plane or its engines." CEO also is calling the captain and the cockpit crew veterans. And you know, there was a similar plane crash a number of years ago in 2008 of a 777 in Heathrow, a British airline plane, in which the engines were found to be the cause. There were some ice pellets that froze. That was apparently rectified. But apparently that is one issue that the investigators will be considering here. Concerning what the CEO of the airline says, that apparently was not the cause. He also is expressing concern for the victims and the victims' families, saying, quote, "I bow my head in apology." Jamie.
Well, South Korea says the two four total on board when Asiana Airlines Flight 214 crashed on the runway at San Francisco International Airport yesterday. And now the investigation is into how this deadly accident happened. Well, we thought it would be a great idea to talk to a commercial pilot. Robert Mark is joining us. He's also the editor of jetwine.com, and we appreciate you being here and telling us a little about the 777. Is there any reason that that plane either saved lives or fell apart? Is there anything specific about this plane that makes it extra safe or extra risky?
Well, Boeing makes really great airplanes, but then so does Airbus, so do all the manufacturers. But there are times that they just cannot take the stress of certain kinds of actions, as we saw yesterday. When you whack the tail of a large aircraft hard enough, it separates. That's what it's designed to do, actually. But again, the stress must have been pretty amazing. But when you look at how much of that aircraft is still intact, even after that fire, again, I think that's a testament to how great an airplane Boeing makes.
Before that tail hit, is there any warning that the pilot might have had? And what is the earliest point at which that pilot would have known there was a problem aboard?
Well, that's an interesting question, Jamie, because what we do know is that they were low. They were way too low in order to land. And the question for me and other pilots is, did they not realize they were that low? Looking out the window, it's very apparent when you're very, very low to the airport, especially going into SFO, because the water just kind of jumps out at you there. But the other question is, if they were aware, was it something that they couldn't deal with? Was there an engine problem? Was there some flight control issue that would not allow them to get the airplane back up to the altitude it needed to be at? That's the part we don't know right now.
Wouldn't a plane of this caliber warn you about the altitude?
Sure. I'm sure that when we hear the cockpit voice recorder tapes, we're going to hear the automation in the background doing that yelp, yelp, pull up call that it does as the as the technology basically calculates how close the aircraft is to the ground and how quickly it's approaching the ground. And it says, hey, if you don't realize you're close, you better know it right now. But again, apparently they were not able for some reason to get the airplane back powered up enough to get past the end of the runway.
So explain, take me inside the cockpit if you can. There's 4 pilots, it's a long flight, and they switch off 2 at a time. 3 of them had 10,000 or more hours of flight time, 1 pretty darn close to that. How experienced are those pilots, and are they all sitting in the cockpit at the time, so even if the 2 at the controls don't realize what's happening, the other 2 can hit them on the shoulder and say, we're in trouble?
Well, you would normally find that all 4 of the pilots would be in the cockpit during the approach to landing. And of course, it is just absolutely common that pilots don't talk about what the other people are doing on the approach, unless something like this comes up where the person perhaps in the jump seat behind the captain realizes we're really low and we are not going to make the runway. They will start yelling at each other.
Will we hear that on the black box? Will we hear any of that?
Absolutely. Absolutely, you should. See, and that's the question we don't know. If we don't hear something like that, when we play these voice recorder tapes back, then something else was seriously wrong.
I know in the military there are flight surgeons that qualify pilots, particularly fighter pilots, which these pilots may have been because many of the pilots from that part of our world are previous veterans of military operations. But what kind of testing do you think was done on them immediately after this crash? What would doctors or even the NTSB or FAA look for?
Well, I think once they checked to make sure that their vitals were good, that they didn't have any broken, and again, I don't know the status of the flight crew, but I'm saying once they figured out that they were breathing all right, that they weren't losing any blood, that there were no broken bones, they would have tested them for drugs and alcohol to make sure that there was not something in their system that may have